All right, hi everyone. So we've been talking about common pooled resources and how to avoid commons tragedies, which are cases where a common pooled resource is exhausted or depleted through overuse. And as we saw, Harding, he called for government intervention and regulation of resources as a way to solve this problem, while Schmitz looked to private ownership as the best solution. Now, Carol Rose, she's a colleague of Schmidt's at the University of Arizona, and she shares his opinion that private ownership is the best solution to commons tragedies and other kind of environmental problems, even on a large scale. And we're talking about like global commons tragedies like climate change. But Rose, her views are a little bit more moderate than Schmidt. She doesn't have quite his enthusiasm for private ownership, and she recognizes that it can bring with it a lot of problems that have to be resolved, especially when we're talking about large-scale resources that can be, or large resources that can be very diffuse, like the atmosphere or the oceans. So Rose talks about what are called property regimes, and a property regime is just a set of rules and mechanisms for enforcing them that govern things like they govern who owns what, how we know who owns what the rules are about what you can do and you can't do with what you own, and how you can transfer ownership either through trade or sales, things of that nature. So there's a role for government in enforcing the property regimes. This is something that the government has to do. And this puts Rose kind of in the middle between Schmitz and Hardin. So even though she, like I said, even though she advocates private ownership, Rose recognizes that it brings with it some problems, some challenges that can emerge to property regimes, especially when the government is not up to doing its job. And she talks about 5 specific categories of major problems, and she talked about those in her paper, and I talk about them in the slides, so I'm not going to talk about them again right now. But one thing that you have to consider is that these kind of problems emerge even in relatively straightforward cases like the division of land, and so that should make you wonder whether or not they can actually be resolved, because they're going to be much more aggravated in situations like trying to divide up resources like the atmosphere or the oceans. So after you consider these problems, you may not necessarily come to the same conclusion that Rose does, which is that a good property regime is always going to be able to overcome these. But the problem is that these all also seem to be problems for government regulations and trying to take that approach as well. If the government for some reason is not up to managing a property regime, it's really questionable whether or not it's going to be up to managing a resource either. So these are difficult issues. One thing that you may want to think about is that the authors that we've read so far rose a little bit less than the others, but they advocate kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. They think that there's going to be one solution to all sorts of commons tragedies, and you may want to question whether that's actually the case or not. All right, so anyway, this should give you a lot to think about, and we'll talk about this some more on Friday.